Nathaniel Hawthorne was born in 1804 in Salem, Massachusetts. His great-great-great-grandfather, whose name was William Hawthorne, came from England to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. That was the year that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established, and of course it's distinct from the Plymouth Colony, which was nearby. If you're interested in that topic, in that time and place, I recommend you check out the episode of this podcast where we looked at the journal of William Bradford, who was a very early governor of the Plymouth Colony, and he governed it for a long time. But back to Nathaniel Hawthorne's ancestor. Hawthorne had many different political positions. He was a judge and a magistrate, and he was notorious, according to some records, for his tough sentencing. And William had a son named John, who is now Nathaniel Hawthorne's great-great-grandfather. And John Hawthorne was one of the judges who oversaw the Salem witch trials. Now you notice their last name is Hawthorne, whereas the last name of the famous author is Hawthorne. It's thought that Hawthorne added the W to his name in his early 20s, not long after he finished college, likely to try to distance himself, to dissociate himself a little bit from these ancestors of his, who were not in particular the type of people who would be at the top of your list to invite to a dinner party. Hawthorne went to Bowdoin College, which of course is still today in Maine, and while he was there he became friends with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whose translation of Dante's Divine Comedy we looked at on this podcast. Of Hawthorne's time at Bowdoin, he later wrote, quote, "I was educated, as the phrase is, at Bowdoin College. I was an idle student, negligent of college rules and the Procrustean details of academic life, rather choosing to nurse my own fancies than to dig into Greek roots and be numbered among the learned Thebans," end quote. So he said he wasn't a very good student, and he nursed his own fancies rather than getting really into Greek or Latin or whatever else it was that they were studying. And that quote summarizes, I think, the differences between bad students who don't end up going anywhere and bad students who do, or at least one of the main differences. There are plenty of stories throughout history of people who neglected their studies in one way or another and then went on to be successful by one measure or another. And then there are other people who neglect their studies and never do anything interesting. And I think one of the differences between those two groups is that the group that becomes successful, in many cases, not always, has neglected their studies in favor of their own independent projects, in favor of stuff that they're working on. Now, I think that the best answer would be to not neglect your studies. There are plenty of notable people throughout history who are also very good students and, for example, got very into Greek roots, or they would have if they'd been living in the 19th century. But if you're going to neglect your studies, if you want to stand a chance, it better be to be working on something that's valuable of your own, and also to have that pay off, because oftentimes people can work on something like that and then it never comes to anything anyway. But in Hawthorne's case, he describes himself as that kind of student, and it turned out very well for him. Hawthorne published his first work in 1828, and he did it anonymously. It was called Fanshawe, and it was based on his experiences at Bowdoin College. And he printed it with his own money. He spent $100, which in those days was a lot more than it is now. And in general, it got positive reviews, but it did not sell very well. He was eventually neighbors with Ralph Waldo Emerson, at whose writing we've looked at on this podcast. And again, I encourage you to go and check that out. And Emerson invited Hawthorne into his circle, but Hawthorne was very shy and apparently didn't talk very much when these friends got together. The book for which Hawthorne is best known is The Scarlet Letter, because it's assigned in high schools across the United States, or at least it was as of 15 years ago. He published it in 1850, and it was significant because it was one of the first mass-produced books in the United States, and it sold 2,500 copies within 10 days, and Hawthorne earned $1,500 from it over 14 years. So about $1,000 a year from one book in those days. That was quite good. And it was in the same year that he went to a picnic that a friend organized, and he met Herman Melville, who's of course the author of Moby Dick, and the two became friends thereafter. Melville was working on Moby Dick at the time, and they became such good friends that Melville dedicated Moby Dick to Hawthorne when it was published the following year in 1851. The dedication reads, quote, "In token of my admiration for his genius, this book is inscribed to Nathaniel Hawthorne," end quote. In 1852, Hawthorne moved to Concord, which is just outside of Boston and, of course, has its own historical significance. And when he was living there, he was neighbors with Henry David Thoreau. One of the things that Hawthorne did that might be vulnerable to criticism was that he wrote a flattering biography of Franklin Pierce, who was a friend and who was running for president at the time. And Hawthorne left out Pierce's drinking habits, which would not have helped him in the polls. And then when Franklin Pierce was elected 14th president of the United States in 1853, Pierce made Hawthorne U.S. consul to Liverpool, which at the time was considered the most lucrative foreign service position. And Hawthorne's wife described it as, quote, "second in dignity to the embassy in London," end quote. So he was the consul, we might today say the consul general, in Liverpool, which was the second most important city in Great Britain after London at the time. And he got this position, it seems in part because he wrote this flattering biography that helped Pierce win the election, rather than for his stellar career in diplomacy, which of course he didn't have. So it's hard not to see that as a kind of cronyism, but you could do worse than having Nathaniel Hawthorne as your consul to Liverpool. And today there's a commemorative plaque in London marking a place where Hawthorne stayed in 1853. Nathaniel Hawthorne died in his sleep in 1864 in Plymouth, New Hampshire, at the age of 59. And he's buried today in a section of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts, that is known as Author's Ridge, where a number of notable authors are buried, including Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, of course, and Louisa May Alcott. The pallbearers at Hawthorne's funeral included Longfellow, Emerson, and Oliver Wendell Holmes. So he had good and notable friends, not only to see him off to eternity, but to keep him company there as well. And a number of these guys also said good things about him after he died. In 1866, Longfellow wrote a poem in honor of Hawthorne called The Bells of Lynn, and Edgar Allan Poe wrote of Hawthorne, quote, "The style of Mr. Hawthorne is purity itself. His tone is singularly effective, wild, plaintive, thoughtful, and in full accordance with his themes. We look upon him as one of the few men of indisputable genius to whom our country has as yet given birth," end quote. Emerson wrote, quote, "Nathaniel Hawthorne's reputation as a writer is a very pleasing fact, because his writing is not good for anything, and this is a tribute to the man," end quote. That might sound like sort of a strange compliment, but I think he means that Hawthorne's writing is not obviously for anything. It's not in favor of this or pushing that, and yet it's still very good and it grabs people, which shows its quality. Henry James, author of The Turn of the Screw, a novel that Hollywood has been poorly imitating for the last 50 years, and The Bostonians, which we will hopefully look at later in the year, among many other things, wrote, quote, "The fine thing in Hawthorne is that he cared for the deeper psychology, and that in his way, he tried to become familiar with it." The book by Hawthorne that we're going to be looking at today is The House of the Seven Gables. And since it's a real structure, it's worth looking at what the House of the Seven Gables actually is. It's also called the Turner House or the Turner Ingersoll Mansion, and it was built in 1668 in Salem, Massachusetts, which is of course Hawthorne's hometown and where his family lived for over a century. It belonged to a cousin of Hawthorne's, whose name was Susanna Ingersoll, and in the past it had been owned by ancestors of Hawthorne who apparently were involved in the Salem witch trials, but I couldn't confirm specifically that that was a reference to John Hathorne, who was a judge in the trials. Today, the house is a nonprofit museum. You can go and pay a fee and take a tour, and it's also a settlement house that has programs for the local immigrant community, including ESL classes and citizenship classes. And the novel is centered around the Pynchon family, which is a real American family. The oldest ancestor in the colonies was William Pynchon, who also, like Hawthorne's ancestor, William Hawthorne arrived at the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. So there's William Pynchon, who is a real guy and also is the ancestor of the Pynchon family. And then there's William Hawthorne, who is Hawthorne's ancestor, the first guy who came to the colonies from his ancestry. And both of these guys arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. But the Pynchon family has at least one other literary connection, and that's that Thomas Pynchon, who in the 20th century wrote Gravity's Rainbow, The Crying of Lot 49, and V. So you'll see in this novel, it deals a lot with the history of families in America. The novel is talking about the Pynchon family, but it seems likely that Hawthorne is reflecting on his own family history, not only because of the similarities between the Pynchon family and the Hawthorne family, but some other people have drawn a connection between a particular character, Judge Pynchon, and John Hawthorne, who, as we discussed, was a judge in the Salem witch trials. And it ties together events that cross multiple centuries, and it reminded me of an H.P. Lovecraft story called The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which I'm not going to get into, but it's another story about a guy and his ancestry and spooky things that come out of it. And it's known that Lovecraft read Hawthorne, so it seems likely he was influenced by the House of the Seven Gables in particular. And while guys like Lovecraft and Poe, of course, take the leap into the supernatural, into putting actual ghosts and monsters and other things in their stories, Hawthorne comes right up to that line and walks along it, but he, for the most part, doesn't cross over it. You'll have to be the judge of whether he does or not. And before getting more into this text, I want to comment on how nice it was to get back into reading something that was originally written in English, not something that was translated to English. A lot of what I've been reading recently, with the exception of Carlyle, has been in translation. Even when we were looking at William Bradford, that was slightly modernized. Not by much, but it wasn't his original words completely. And of course, reading things in translation is valuable for a lot of different reasons that we've talked about. But there will still be a little bit of a cultural distance there. For example, anytime you read an expression in a translation, 12 short of a dozen, or whatever it might be, it's very likely that the translator is trying to translate an expression in the source language that is not easy to translate. And so they've picked the closest corollary in English, which is often imperfect. Also, you're reading the labor not only of the original writer, but the translator as well. And translators can be as careful or as careless as writers are, which is why it's worth it to note fastidious translators like Simon Armitage, and especially legendary ones like Richard Wilbur. But it's special in a different way to read something in the original language, especially if that original language is your native language, and you can see exactly the words that the writer picked. When you're reading a translation, you focus more on themes and ideas in a text, while when you're looking at the original, you can think of the precise wording. He said it in exactly this way. These are the words that he put on his paper with his pen however many hundred years ago. And I find there's a different kind of a proximity, a closeness in that. To talk about the novel generally, it has a lot in it about family history, about the past and the present and the future and how those relate to each other. It has a lot about the new and the old, psychology and mesmerism, which were two emerging fields at the time. Of course, mesmerism is not taken seriously anymore. Franz Anton Mesmer, this is actually where we get the word mesmerize. He was a guy who developed a theory about animal magnetism, and the energies that he theorized were in all living things. And what we today call hypnosis was initially called mesmerism, and it was named after this guy. I think it was his technique, or an early version of it was developed by him. And mesmerism is mentioned in particular by one of the characters in the novel, but both that character and the house itself has a kind of a hypnotic quality. So it's both referenced directly in the text and also indirectly in the story. And of course, psychology, while mesmerism is now considered quack science, psychology today is still considered a major field of research. But at the time, both of these fields were relatively new, and in the novel, they represent the future. Not necessarily that Hawthorne thought that the future was mesmerism, but that these represented change and some kind of distinct category from the past. There are a lot of shadows in this novel, a lot of dark corners and hallways to explore. It would definitely be worth reading again, because I'm sure that there are all sorts of connections built into it that you wouldn't notice necessarily on the first read. One of the ways that Hawthorne walks this line with the supernatural is that he will reference things that are supernatural, things like a painting sighing or somebody seeing a skeletal hand on someone's neck at the moment of their death. And then he'll say, but these are the kinds of rumors that spread inevitably around such an event. So he'll put it in your mind, these images that would fit comfortably in horror literature, but he maintains the prudence of dismissing these sorts of things as unbelievable to the respectable and saying they shouldn't be taken seriously. Another example is that there's a document that's very central to the story that's missing, and one character in particular is trying to find it because it would mean that the Pynchon family has control of a lot more land than it currently does, and he's a member of the Pynchon family. And people had been looking for this document in the past too, and when Hawthorne talks about that, he says that there was a rumor that the document was in the hand of the corpse of another character from the past in his coffin. And of course, the lawyers don't take this rumor seriously, but just to be thorough, they go and dig up the body, and they find that the hand is missing. So it's this kind of ambiguity that makes The House of the Seven Gables not exactly a ghost story in that it doesn't have spirits floating around in hallways, but it has the past influencing the present, and it has these kinds of gothic motifs. And I have also in my notes that character who in certain ways represents the future or emerging developments in knowledge and science and political philosophy is also a daguerreotypist. And a daguerreotype is that old-fashioned kind of photograph that's not just black and white, it's sort of off-white from the mid-19th century. It's a very early kind of photograph, and this too would have been an emerging technology at the time. So now we can get into some passages from The House of the Seven Gables. And this first one is part of setting up the background of this tension between the Mall family and the Pynchon family. And this goes on hundreds of years before the main action in the story, and there's this character, Matthew Mall, who's accused of witchcraft and executed. And he's accused because a member of the Pynchon family, who's alive at that time, wants his land. And Matthew is the father of Thomas, who builds the House of the Seven Gables. So this tension over land and the history of a piece of land and a family, which is a classic New England thing, is central to the story. The passage reads, quote, "Old Matthew Mall, in a word, was executed for the crime of witchcraft. He was one of the martyrs to that terrible delusion which should teach us, among its other morals, that the influential classes and those who take upon themselves to be leaders of the people are fully liable to all the passionate error that has ever characterized the maddest mob. Clergymen, judges, statesmen, the wisest, calmest, holiest persons of their day stood in the inner circle round about the gallows, loudest to applaud the work of blood, latest to confess themselves miserably deceived. If any one part of their proceedings can be said to deserve less blame than another, it was the singular indiscrimination with which they persecuted not merely the poor and aged, as in former judicial massacres, but people of all ranks, their own equals, brethren, and wives. Amid the disorder of such various ruin, it is not strange that a man of inconsiderable note like Mall should have trodden the martyr's path to the hill of execution almost unremarked in the throng of his fellow sufferers." End quote. So he's saying that the trials over witchcraft, and those happened in Europe for much longer than they happened in the colonies. By the time the colonies were established, they were basically coming to an end, but they'd gone on for a long time in Europe before that, are an example of how the ruling class is just as liable to be deceived and mistaken on a large scale as the masses are, they're not exempt from this. They're not invulnerable to it. This next section describes the House of the Seven Gables itself. Quote, "All as they approached looked upward at the imposing edifice, which was henceforth to assume its rank among the habitations of mankind. There it rose, a little withdrawn from the line of the street, but in pride, not modesty." Skipping ahead, "The many lattices, with their small diamond-shaped panes, admitted the sunlight into hall and chamber, while nevertheless the second story, projecting far over the base and itself retiring beneath the third, threw a shadowy and thoughtful gloom into the lower rooms. Carved globes of wood were affixed under the jutting stories. Little spiral rods of iron beautified each of the 7 peaks. On the triangular portion of the gable that fronted next the street was a dial, put up that very morning, and on which the sun was still marking the passage of the first bright hour in a history that was not destined to be also bright. All around were scattered shavings, chips, shingles, and broken halves of bricks. These, together with the lately turned earth on which the grass had not begun to grow, contributed to the impression of strangeness and novelty proper to a house that had yet its place to make among men's daily interests. The principal entrance, which had almost the breadth of a church door, was in the angle between the 2 front gables and was covered by an open porch, with benches beneath its shelter." Skipping ahead again, "The street in which it upreared its venerable peaks has long ceased to be a fashionable quarter of the town, so that though the old edifice was surrounded by habitations of modern date, they were mostly small, built entirely of wood, and typical of the most plodding uniformity of common life. Doubtless, however, the whole story of human existence may be latent in each of them, but with no picturesqueness externally that can attract the imagination or sympathy to seek it there. But as for the old structure of our story, its white oak frame and its boards, shingles, and crumbling plaster, and even the huge clustered chimney in the midst seemed to constitute only the least and meanest part of its reality. So much of mankind's varied experience had passed there, so much had been suffered, and something too enjoyed, that the very timbers were oozy, as with the moisture of a heart. It was itself like a great human heart, with a life of its own, and full of rich and somber reminiscences. The deep projection of the second story gave the house such a meditative look that you could not pass it without the idea that it had secrets to keep and an eventful history to moralize upon." End quote. He later makes a nice passing commentary on newspapers, and here he uses the word tradition, and what he's referring to is knowledge that is passed down orally, not necessarily a tradition like putting up a Christmas tree. Quote, "Tradition, which sometimes brings down truth that history has let slip, but is oftener the wild babble of the time, such as was formerly spoken at the fireside, and now congeals in newspapers. Tradition is responsible for all contrary averments." End quote. So he says that tradition is often the wild babble of the time, such as was formerly spoken at the fireside, and now congeals in newspapers. That might be a bit generous to newspapers, but it's a nice description. And one of the main characters opens up a shop in the first floor of the House of the Seven Gables. She owns the house, and she had been a relatively aristocratic lady all of her life, but now she has to open up a shop to earn a little extra money, and she's very humiliated by this, and that's something else we'll talk about. But talking about the shop, Hawthorne writes, quote, "Now, though the shop window was still closely curtained from the public gaze, a remarkable change had taken place in its interior. The rich and heavy festoons of cobweb, which it had cost a long ancestral succession of spiders their life's labor to spin and weave, had been carefully brushed away from the ceiling. The counter, shelves, and floor had all been scoured, and the latter was overstrewn with fresh blue sand." End quote. I like that description of the cobwebs in the store having been built by the life's labor of a long ancestral succession of spiders. So this was the work of a dynasty of spiders, each one working for their whole lives to build these cobwebs, and then she comes in and sweeps them away. And there's a comparable passage about the lineage of the chickens in the garden of the House of the Seven Gables. And of course, ancestry and human descendants and families are a major part of the story as well, and were clearly a part of Hawthorne's thinking, in part because of his own family history. And there are a lot of passages on this topic in the book. And on the one hand, nobody should rest purely on the nobility of their bloodline. Nobody should expect praise or feel themselves to be very special purely because of who their ancestors are. On the contrary, if you come from a family that has shined in one way or another, or have notable lineage of any kind, you have more responsibility, not less, to do something interesting and useful and productive with your life and to contribute to the well-being and safety and knowledge and culture of your community. And Hawthorne was living in a different time. First, he was, of course, as we've seen, confronting things in the history of his own family that maybe were sort of difficult for him. But also, he lived in a time where these kinds of family lineages carried more weight, and to criticize the default status that any useless member of such a family had was perhaps more unusual and certainly more necessary than it is now. But now the pendulum has swung the other way, and I think very few Americans know much about their own family history, whether it's illustrious or what would be called ordinary. And while there are certainly topics that are more worth learning about than your own family history, plenty of people know all kinds of details about the most vapid hogwash that you can think of, and then know absolutely nothing about the converging lines of people who struggled and sacrificed in myriad ways that resulted in the life and existence that that person has now. Because that's what we're talking about when we say family history. We're not necessarily saying this person was a general in such and such a battle, or that person was part of the council that advised that monarch, but the people from the past whose DNA you share and whose work, whether it was farming or shoemaking or barrel making or saddle making, or that skill that is truly indispensable to a healthy society, and which fully half of all of our ancestors practiced, homemaking. All of this work sustained and developed the society and culture into which you were then born. So when we talk about family history, we're not talking about people taking pride in things that they didn't themselves achieve. We're talking about having a more detailed and historical and fact-based knowledge of yourself, the environment that you were born into and grew up in, and how and why you are who you are. So while Hawthorne was perhaps reacting against the former, it would be a mistake for us to lose the latter in that reaction. This next passage is a description of how that aristocratic lady whom I had mentioned before and whose name was Hepzibah felt better than she expected to when she was actually running her little shop. Quote, "Nevertheless, even while she paraded these ideas somewhat ostentatiously through her mind, it is altogether surprising what a calmness had come over her. The anxiety and misgivings which had tormented her, whether asleep or in melancholy daydreams, ever since her project began to take an aspect of solidity, had now vanished quite away. She felt the novelty of her position, indeed, but no longer with disturbance or affright. Now and then there came a thrill of almost youthful enjoyment. It was the invigorating breath of a fresh outward atmosphere after the long torpor and monotonous seclusion of her life. So wholesome is effort, so miraculous the strength that we do not know of. The healthiest glow that Hepzibah had known for years had come now in the dreaded crisis when for the first time she had put forth her hand to help herself." End quote. That's a nice short passage about the satisfaction you can get from doing your own work and earning your own way. Here's a short line about a certain kind of person. Quote, "Individuals whose affairs have reached an utterly desperate crisis almost invariably keep themselves alive with hopes, so much the more airily magnificent as they have the less of solid matter within their grasp whereof to mold any judicious and moderate expectation of good." End quote. That's talking about how people who have less going on or perhaps feel less hopeful can sometimes be given to even more magnificent daydreams about what's going to come for them in the future. And to give another example of this thing I was talking about where Hawthorne puts in these supernatural winks without having anything truly supernatural in the story, or at least nothing central to the action that if you took it out, the story would be significantly changed. This passage mentions a character named Phoebe, who is a 17-year-old cousin of Hepzibah, who is 60 or so. Hawthorne writes, Quote, "I thought there were no Pynchons left, except yourself and our own cousin Jaffrey," answered Phoebe. "And yet I seem to have heard the name of Clifford Pynchon." "Yes, from my father and my mother. But has he not been a long while dead?" "Well, well, child, perhaps he has," said Hepzibah with a sad, hollow laugh. "But in old houses like this, you know, dead people are very apt to come back again." End quote. In another passage describing a certain kind of person, Hawthorne writes, quote, "It is very genuine admiration that with which persons too shy or too awkward to take due part in the bustling world regard the real actors in life's stirring scenes. So genuine, in fact, that the former are usually fain to make it palatable to their self-love by assuming that these active and forcible qualities are incompatible with others, which they choose to deem higher and more important." End quote. And that's a rather complicated thought without the context. There, Hepzibah, the older woman, is admiring how Phoebe, the younger girl, is quite good at managing this shop that they have. And both of them are members of the Pynchon family, but Hepzibah has more of a hang-up about running a shop, which is a relatively low-class thing, whereas Phoebe just sees it as an interesting project. And Hepzibah, in a way, is admiring Phoebe's ability to do this, but what Hawthorne is saying is that people who are not good at mixing in the world, at going out and doing sales or doing business or whatever it might be, are likely to admire people who can do that, but they admire them in a sort of way that still makes them feel better about themselves, which is that they say, I'm not good at that kind of thing because I'm this kind of person. I'm more introspective or more contemplative, or I don't get along with ordinary people, or whatever it might be, whatever explanation they have. And that other trait that they attribute to themselves, they deem that to be more important. So this kind of person can admire somebody who's outgoing and mixes in the world, but they're not even really admiring them. They're saying, they have something that I don't have because that's incompatible with this other more important thing that I have, this other trait that I have. Another part of the story, talking about family history and how the past affects the present and how what our ancestors did affects our lives today. There's a character named Alice who comes up a few times, and she has a pretty important part at one point in the story. But she lived, again, some period before the main action of the story. And she also planted some posies, though all she really did to plant them was throw a handful of seeds at some point as a joke. And then over time, dust and dirt fell on top of them. And now in the modern day in the story, there are posies in the yard that she planted. And you want to be careful about overreading. You don't want to try to put something on the story that maybe the author didn't mean. But whether Hawthorne intended it this way or not, this is an example of how even the unintentional, unplanned, secondary, unimportant actions of people in the past can affect the future, and our actions today affect the future in the same way. But Alice's posies are mentioned a number of times in the story, so Hawthorne certainly thought something about them. Hawthorne writes, quote, "When the customer was gone, Hepzibah talked rather vaguely and at great length about a certain Alice Pynchon, who had been exceedingly beautiful and accomplished in her lifetime 100 years ago. The fragrance of her rich and delightful character still lingered about the place where she had lived, as a dried rosebud scents the drawer where it is withered and perished. This lovely Alice had met with some great mysterious calamity, and had grown thin and white, and gradually faded out of the world. But even now she was supposed to haunt the house of the Seven Gables, and a great many times, especially when one of the Pynchons was to die, she had been heard playing sadly and beautifully on the harpsichord. One of these tunes, just as it had sounded from her spiritual touch, had been written down by an amateur of music. It was so exquisitely mournful that nobody, to this day, could bear to hear it played, unless when a great sorrow had made them know the still profounder sweetness of it." End quote. So Alice Pynchon sometimes haunted the house by playing on the harpsichord when somebody was about to die. And here's that passage about the ancestry of the chickens that I had mentioned. Quote, "The chicken crept through the pales of the coop and ran, with some show of liveliness, to her feet, while Chanticleer is the rooster, and the ladies of his household regarded her with queer sidelong glances, and then croaked one to another, as if communicating their sage opinions of her character. So wise as well as antique was their aspect as to give color to the idea not merely that they were the descendants of a time-honored race, but that they had existed in their individual capacity ever since the House of the Seven Gables was founded and were somehow mixed up with its destiny. They were a species of tutelary sprite, or banshee, although winged and feathered differently from most other guardian angels." End quote. There's another passage somewhere about how the chickens like to eat snails, and they do it in a very refined and elite way. And maybe that's just meant to be sort of funny, but it also might be a commentary on people taking themselves and their refinements a little too seriously, in that even chickens have this kind of posturing. But also this passage I just read both touches on this notion of ancestry, talks about the line of chickens, but also the supernatural aspect of the novel, in that there's a light suggestion that the chickens are some kind of immortal being that has always been with the house. They're kind of a spirit rather than ordinary chickens. One of Hepzibah's customers is a little boy, and he shows up a few times in the story, and he likes to come to the store and buy what we would today call animal crackers. They're little cookies or something that are in the shape of various animals and figures. And Hawthorne writes of him, quote, "This remarkable urchin, in truth, was the very emblem of old Father Time, both in respect of his all-devouring appetite for men and things, and because he, as well as Time, after engulfing thus much of creation, looked almost as youthful as if he had been just that moment made." End quote. This next passage talks about Phoebe seeing another character, Judge Pynchon, who's the main antagonist in the story. And earlier, Holgrave, the daguerreotypist, the younger guy who's into forward-looking ideas and technologies, showed her a miniature, a little picture, and she said, "Oh, that looks just like my ancestor, this guy whose portrait is hanging in this room in the house." And Holgrave says, "I assure you this is a modern subject." And she doesn't know who he's talking about at the time, but later, when she's looking at Judge Pynchon, she realizes that that miniature was of him, not of her ancestor, but she's very surprised by how similar they look, and she has a thought about it. Hawthorne writes, quote, "Then, all at once, it struck Phoebe that this very Judge Pynchon was the original of the miniature which the daguerreotypist had shown her in the garden, and that the hard, stern, relentless look now on his face was the same that the sun had so inflexibly persisted in bringing out. Was it, therefore, no momentary mood, but however skillfully concealed the settled temper of his life? And not merely so, but was it hereditary in him, and transmitted down, as a precious heirloom, from that bearded ancestor, in whose picture both the expression and, to a singular degree, the features of the modern judge were shown as by a kind of prophecy? A deeper philosopher than Phoebe might have found something very terrible in this idea. It implied that the weaknesses and defects, the bad passions, the mean tendencies, and the moral diseases which lead to crime are handed down from one generation to another by a far surer process of transmission than human law has been able to establish in respect to the riches and honors which it seeks to entail upon posterity." End quote. So he's saying that the resemblance between Judge Pynchon and the ancestor, these two guys looking the same and having this same hard, stern look, that maybe was not just a passing moment, but that was the settled temper of their lives. That was the more natural state for them. Then Hawthorne says that this implies that a man's bad traits are hereditary. And it's hard not to imagine that Hawthorne was reflecting on his own ancestor, John Hathorne, who was a judge in the witch trials, and maybe wondering if he had some of those bad traits in himself. In talking about records that are kept, Hawthorne writes, quote, "Besides these cold, formal, and empty words of the chisel that inscribes, the voice that speaks, and the pen that writes, for the public eye and for distant time, and which inevitably lose much of their truth and freedom by the fatal consciousness of so doing, there were traditions about the ancestor, and private diurnal gossip about the judge, remarkably accordant in their testimony. It is often instructive to take the woman's, the private and domestic, view of a public man. Nor can anything be more curious than the vast discrepancy between portraits intended for engraving and the pencil sketches that pass from hand to hand behind the original's back." End quote. So he's saying that records that are made in order to be read by posterity are inherently flawed by the consciousness of their having been prepared that way, and that it's better to take the record that a woman keeps, the woman who lives with a man, his wife, most likely, as the better measure of that man. That's more honest that's more candid. And another interesting line on this notion of ancestry, Hawthorne writes, quote, "But it is too fruitful a subject, this of hereditary resemblances, the frequent recurrence of which in a direct line is truly unaccountable, when we consider how large an accumulation of ancestry lies behind every man at the distance of 1 or 2 centuries." End quote. And this made me think of a photograph I saw sometime in the last few years of my grandfather, who died now 15 years ago or so. It was a photo of him probably in the late 30s, and he was at Mount Katahdin in Maine, and he was there with his fiancée, my grandmother, but they weren't married yet, but both of his parents were there also to chaperone. I thought that was quaint that they, of course, wouldn't go on this trip by themselves unmarried. They went with his parents. But anyway, in this photo, my grandfather looks just like my brother, or rather, my younger brother looks just like my grandfather in this photo, so much so that I sent it to him and I said, "Look, you've been time traveling and you don't even know it." I really felt like I was looking at a black and white photo of my younger brother. It was very eerie. So probably if we could see portraits of everybody in our ancestry, there would be more resemblances than we would expect. And that's part of what Hawthorne is getting at here. And here's another passage about the chickens that I was talking about. And then it gets into a little bit of something else. Quote, "All hens are well worth studying for the piquancy and rich variety of their manners, but by no possibility can there have been other fowls of such odd appearance and deportment as these ancestral ones. They probably embodied the traditionary peculiarities of their whole line of progenitors, derived through an unbroken succession of eggs, or else this individual Chanticleer and his 2 wives had grown to be humorists, and a little crack-brained withal, on account of their solitary way of life, and out of sympathy for Hephzibah, their lady patroness. We linger too long, no doubt, beside this paltry rivulet of life that flowed through the garden of the Pyncheon house, but we deem it pardonable to record these mean incidents and poor delights because they proved so greatly to Clifford's benefit. They had the earth smell in them, and contributed to give him health and substance. Some of his occupations wrought less desirably upon him. He had a singular propensity, for example, to hang over Mall's Well, and look at the constantly shifting phantasmagoria of figures produced by the agitation of the water over the mosaic work of colored pebbles at the bottom. He said that faces looked upward to him there, beautiful faces, arrayed in bewitching smiles, each momentary face so fair and rosy and every smile so sunny that he felt wronged at its departure, until the same flitting witchcraft made a new one. But sometimes he would suddenly cry out, "The dark face gazes at me," and be miserable the whole day afterwards. Phoebe, when she hung over the fountain by Clifford's side, could see nothing at all this, neither the beauty nor the ugliness, but only the colored pebbles, looking as if the gush of the waters shook and disarranged them. And the dark face that so troubled Clifford was no more than the shadow thrown from a branch of one of the damson trees, and breaking the inner light of Mall's Well. End quote. Clifford is another main character in the story. He's an older guy whom Hephzibah hangs out with. He's her brother. And there he's being haunted by something that he thinks he sees in the well. And one thing that makes The House of the Seven Gables more effective than a typical ghost story where there are spooky things floating around is that this story shows how people can be haunted in real life. Things from your past can follow you. People who have died a long time ago can create problems for you in real life, not only under the altered rules of a horror movie. This next passage is a little longer, and it deals with an organ grinder and a monkey. And you know, an organ grinder is somebody who would play a barrel organ or a street organ, this kind of mechanical thing that you crank and it plays music. They would play it in the street to earn some money, to busk. Hawthorne writes, quote, "But anything that appealed to the sense of beauty, in however humble a way, did not require to be recommended by these old associations. This was observable when one of those Italian boys, who are rather a modern feature of our streets, came along with his barrel organ and stopped under the wide and cool shadows of the elm. With his quick professional eye, he took note of the 2 faces watching him from the arched window and, opening his instrument, began to scatter its melodies abroad. He had a monkey on his shoulder, dressed in a Highland plaid, and to complete the sum of splendid attractions wherewith he presented himself to the public, there was a company of little figures whose sphere and habitation was in the mahogany case of his organ, and whose principle of life was the music which the Italian made it his business to grind out." In all their variety of occupation, the cobbler, the blacksmith, the soldier, the lady with her fan, the toper with his bottle, the milkmaid sitting by her cow, this fortunate little society might truly be said to enjoy a harmonious existence and to make life literally a dance. The Italian turned a crank, and behold, every one of these small individuals started into the most curious vivacity. The cobbler wrought upon a shoe, the blacksmith hammered his iron, the soldier waved his glittering blade, the lady raised a tiny breeze with her fan, the jolly toper swigged lustily at his bottle, a scholar opened his book with eager thirst for knowledge and turned his head to and fro along the page. The milkmaid energetically drained her cow, and a miser counted gold into his strong-box, all at the same turning of a crank. Yes, and moved by the self-same impulse, a lover saluted his mistress on her lips. Possibly some cynic, at once merry and bitter, had desired to signify in this pantomimic scene that we mortals, whatever our business or amusement, however serious, however trifling, all dance to one identical tune, and in spite of our ridiculous activity, bring nothing finally to pass. For the most remarkable aspect of the affair was that at the cessation of the music, everybody was petrified at once, from the most extravagant life into a dead torpor. Neither was the cobbler's shoe finished, nor the blacksmith's iron shaped out, nor was there a drop less of brandy in the toper's bottle, nor a drop more of milk in the milkmaid's pail, nor one additional coin in the miser's strong-box, nor was the scholar a page deeper in his book. All were precisely in the same condition as before they made themselves so ridiculous by their haste to toil, to enjoy, to accumulate gold, and to become wise. Saddest of all, moreover, the lover was none the happier for the maiden's granted kiss. But rather than swallow this last too acrid ingredient, we reject the whole moral of the show. End quote. So we'll stop there for a second. So he's describing this barrel organ that, along with playing music, it's got these little mechanical figures, probably made of wood, dancing around. A blacksmith and a cobbler and a milkmaid and a guy counting money and a guy reading a book and a guy kissing a lady. And as the music plays, they do these little actions over and over again. And then when the music stops, they all stop too. And Hawthorne says that the lessons that this little machine teaches include how everyone in life dances to the same tune. They're all driven by the same force. And they hurry about and do all these things, but then when they stop suddenly, and they do stop, they're no further along for having done all of their work. They're no better off for it. And he's talking about death, and that's a kind of nihilism that I don't agree with, but this is a nice example of how a good writer, in addition to being very careful and inventive with the use of language, a good writer is also somebody who can observe something that people have seen millions of times and not noticed anything special about it, and the writer can pull an interesting thought, an interesting observation from that ordinary subject. Now, picking up from the same spot, quote, "The monkey, meanwhile, with a thick tail curling out into preposterous prolixity from beneath his tartans, took his station at the Italian's feet. He turned a wrinkled and abominable little visage to every passer-by, and to the circle of children that soon gathered round, and to Hepzibah's shop door, and upward to the arched window, whence Phoebe and Clifford were looking down. Every moment also he took off his Highland bonnet and performed a bow and scrape. Sometimes, moreover, he made personal application to individuals, holding out his small black palm and otherwise plainly signifying his excessive desire for whatever filthy lucre might happen to be in anybody's pocket. The mean and low, yet strangely manlike expression of his wilted countenance, the prying and crafty glance that showed him ready to gripe at every miserable advantage, his enormous tail, too enormous to be decently concealed under his garbadine, and the deviltry of nature which it betokened. Take this monkey just as he was, in short, and you could desire no better image of the mammon of copper coin, symbolizing the grossest form of the love of money. Neither was there any possibility of satisfying the covetous little devil. Phoebe threw down a whole handful of cents, which he picked up with joyless eagerness, handed them over to the Italian for safekeeping, and immediately recommenced a series of pantomimic petitions for more. Doubtless, more than one New Englander, or let him be of what country he might, it is as likely to be the case, passed by and threw a look at the monkey, and went on, without imagining how nearly his own moral condition was here exemplified." End quote. So first he was looking at the barrel organ, and now he's looking at the monkey, and drawing a comparison between the way that the monkey is always asking for money, and he always wants more money, and he loves it, and he gathers it up, and he doesn't seem to have any fun when he's gathering it up, but he gathers it up very quickly, and then he immediately asks for more, and that this is a reasonable portrait of the moral condition of many people, if not almost everybody. And another time, Clifford is blowing soap bubbles. Hawthorne writes, quote, "One afternoon he was seized with an irresistible desire to blow soap bubbles, an amusement, as Hepzibah told Phoebe apart, that had been a favorite one with her brother when they were both children. Behold him, therefore, at the arched window, with an earthen pipe in his mouth. Behold him with his gray hair and a wan, unreal smile over his countenance, where still hovered a beautiful grace, which his worst enemy must have acknowledged to be spiritual and immortal, since it had survived so long. Behold him, scattering airy spheres abroad from the window into the street. Little impalpable worlds were those soap bubbles, with the big world depicted in hues bright as imagination on the nothing of their surface. It was curious to see how the passers-by regarded these brilliant fantasies as they came floating down and made the dull atmosphere imaginative about them. Some stopped to gaze and perhaps carried a pleasant recollection of the bubbles onward as far as the street corner. Some looked angrily upward, as if poor Richard wronged them by setting an image of beauty afloat so near their dusty pathway. A great many put out their fingers or their walking sticks to touch withal, and were perversely gratified, no doubt, when the bubble, with all its pictured earth and sky seen, vanished, as if it had never been." End quote. This next passage deals with the notion of youth and maybe of a second youth. Quote, "Our first youth is of no value, for we are never conscious of it until after it is gone. But sometimes, always, I suspect, unless one is exceedingly unfortunate, there comes a sense of second youth, gushing out of the heart's joy at being in love, or possibly it may come to crown some other grand festival in life, if any other such there be. This bemoaning of oneself, as you do now, over the first careless, shallow gaiety of youth departed, and this profound happiness that youth regained, so much deeper and richer than what we lost, are essential to the soul's development. In some cases, the two states come almost simultaneously, and mingle the sadness and the rapture in one mysterious emotion." End quote. And there is a phenomenon that can be called something like the development of the soul. The soul is kind of a strange word, and you can get into trouble with it. Is there a soul? Isn't there one? If there is it immortal? And if we wanted to put it in the most stark terms of modern science, we might just say the development of the personality, or of the effect of experience on a person. But there's an enriching, a deepening, a widening, a texturing of a person that happens as time goes on, able to reflect on their experiences and learn from them, that is distinct from an accumulation of knowledge. And this is one of the reasons why, if you read a book like The House of the Seven Gables in high school, you are probably much less likely to get anything out of it than you would if you read it even in your 20s or your 30s, or presumably at an older age. And that's not because the high schooler lacks factual knowledge that the older person has, but rather it's because their soul is not yet fully developed, to use a very poetical language. Or we could also say they don't have certain kinds of experience, or to use the language of psychology, their personality has not matured. Whenever I find myself using different vague phrases to try to describe the same thing, I have this sense that there's something there, but we don't quite know how to get at it yet. Anyway, Hawthorne gave us that short little passage about the idea of the development of the soul, so that's something to think about. Then there are a couple passages about technology that are certainly worth reflecting on. Clifford and Hepzibah are on a train now, talking to somebody on the train. It's Clifford speaking first. Hawthorne writes, quote, "It had just occurred to me, on the contrary, that this admirable invention of the railroad, with the vast and inevitable improvements to be looked for, both as to speed and convenience, is destined to do away with those stale ideas of home and fireside and substitute something better. In the name of common sense, asked the old gentleman rather testily, what can be better for a man than his own parlor and chimney corner? These things have not the merit which many good people attribute to them, replied Clifford. They may be said, in few and pithy words, to have ill-served a poor purpose. My impression is that our wonderfully increased and still increasing facilities of locomotion are destined to bring us around again to the nomadic state. You are aware, my dear sir, you must have observed it in your own experience, that all human progress is in a circle, or to use a more accurate and beautiful figure, in an ascending spiral curve. While we fancy ourselves going straight forward and attaining at every step an entirely new position of affairs, we do actually return to something long ago tried and abandoned, but which we now find etherealized, refined, and perfected to its ideal. The past is but a coarse and sensual prophecy of the present and the future. To apply this truth to the topic now under discussion, in the early epochs of our race, men dwelt in temporary huts, of bowers of branches as easily constructed as a bird's nest, and which they built, if it should be called building, when such sweet homes of a summer solstice rather grew than were made with hands, which nature, we will say, assisted them to rear where fruit abounded, where fish and game were plentiful, or most especially where the sense of beauty was to be gratified by a lovelier shade than elsewhere, and a more exquisite arrangement of lake, wood, and hill. This life possessed a charm which ever since man quitted it has vanished from existence, and it typified something better than itself. It had its drawbacks, such as hunger and thirst, inclement weather, hot sunshine, and weary and foot-blistering marches over barren and ugly tracts that lay between the sites desirable for their fertility and beauty. But in our ascending spiral, we escape all this. These railroads, could but the whistle be made musical, and the rumble and the jar got rid of, are positively the greatest blessing that the ages have wrought out for us. They give us wings. They annihilate the toil and dust of pilgrimage. They spiritualize travel. Transition being so facile, what can be any man's inducement to tarry in one spot? Why, therefore, should he build a more cumbrous habitation than can readily be carried off with him? Why should he make himself a prisoner for life in brick and stone, and old worm-eaten timber, when he may just as easily dwell in one sense, nowhere, in a better sense, wherever the fit and beautiful shall offer him a home?" End quote. In that passage, I think Hawthorne is speaking with his own voice. Sometimes in a novel, a writer can use a character to articulate an argument that he doesn't necessarily think is true, and then something will happen to that character to show that what he said is false in some way. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think that Hawthorne is speaking through Clifford. He's speculating about this emerging technology of railroads, and he's optimistic about it. He sees it as a positive development, and he says that this technology is destined to bring us around again to the nomadic state. And he views this not as a regression to some former lower state of humanity, but as part of this upward spiral of development, that history is neither linear nor secular, but both, in that it spirals upward. So it circles back on itself, but all the while it's also ascending. And in retrospect, a prediction about mass transportation and a change in the way that people settle, the way that they live, maybe is not such an amazing prediction. That might seem obvious to us now, but I'm not sure how many people were thinking in those terms in 1851 when this was published. And mass transportation, like any technological development, definitely had a major effect on how we live. And one of the things that it eventually allowed for, though this wasn't really done by the railroad, it was done more by cars in the second half of the 20th century, was for people to move around very easily, for example, for work. So if a company could benefit from moving an employee around, and they could make it enticing enough to the employee by giving them a raise or something to go along with it, then people were much more likely to move around and live in multiple cities or towns during the course of their life than they would have been before mass transportation. Now, the trouble is that if you're imagining one employee moving around from one town to another, and he's sort of coming into port in an existing dock. When he moves to a new town, he's coming into an established place and then being part of that community. And then maybe 5 or 10 years later, he does it again and moves somewhere else. Then that might still be a relatively stable way, not necessarily for that employee to live because he's moving all around, but there are still communities that he is now entering into and then leaving. The trouble is that if everybody lives that way, if when he moves to a new city or town, he's moving not into an established community of people who have lived there all for a very long time, but simply into another collection of people who are in a similar position as him, who have not lived there for very long, do not plan to live there for very long, are not very invested in that community, in building it up, in making sure that the relations stay strong, not for a couple years, but for generations, then this will radically affect and perhaps dissolve that community. And I say this now having lived in places that fall into both of these categories. There are still places in the United States that have this kind of established community where some significant portion of the population has lived in that place for their whole life and has no plans to leave. And the social relations in that kind of environment are different from, most notably, those of very big cities, where a much larger portion of the population, I don't have any numbers on this, I'm not sure how you could get them, has arrived in the city sometime in the last 5 years and will leave the city sometime in the next 5 years. And this doesn't only apply to the biggest cities in the country. But anyway, to get back to Hawthorne, he's making this prediction about the long-term effect of the railroad. And it's not a very detailed prediction. He doesn't really flesh it out. That's not really what he's trying to do. But his prediction here to me seems a little bit rosy. Not that mass transportation is an inherently terrible thing, but it's not purely good. It does have drawbacks. And this matters not so that with the benefit of hindsight we can tease Hawthorne about having gotten something wrong or partially wrong, because the lifestyle I'm describing, this modern lifestyle that a lot of people live by today, is quite nomadic, actually. So Hawthorne was right about that. The question is, how desirable is it? How beneficial is it for human communities? The reason why these questions matter in the context of this novel is that there is a tension in this story about the past and new knowledge and new technology. We talked about the daguerreotype, we talked about mentions of psychology, we talked about mesmerism. These kinds of concepts are mostly embodied by Holgrave, who's a young guy. We didn't talk about him very much. He's an interesting character. And he's into very new things. And by the end of the story, something has happened that maybe will change Holgrave's outlook a little. And the fact that he's young makes me also think that maybe Hawthorne was using him to exemplify a type that may be correct and may be incorrect on certain things, but he wasn't necessarily ventriloquizing through Holgrave. And the fact that this little speech about the railroad came not from Holgrave but from Clifford makes me think that Hawthorne agreed more with what Clifford said than with some of the things that Holgrave said, which we didn't go into at all. And if you want to see, you'll have to read the book for yourself if you haven't already. But so this tension of old and new is built into the walls of the House of the Seven Gables, pun intended. So Hawthorne speculating about emerging technology is not just a little footnote, a rhapsody that he throws in at the end. In a certain way, it's almost a counterbalance to some of the dark stuff in the past that is central to the novel. And now let's look at the next one. Later on in the same scene, Clifford says, quote, "Then there is electricity, the demon, the angel, the mighty physical power, the all-pervading intelligence," exclaimed Clifford. "Is that a humbug too? Is it a fact, or have I dreamt it? That by means of electricity the world of matter has become a great nerve, vibrating thousands of miles in a breathless point of time. Rather, the round globe is a vast head, a brain, instinct with intelligence. Or shall we say, it is itself a thought, nothing but thought, and no longer the substance which we deemed it." "If you mean the telegraph," said the old gentleman, glancing his eye toward its wire alongside the rail track, "it is an excellent thing. That is, of course, if the speculators in cotton and politics don't get possession of it." End quote. And this guy with whom Clifford is speaking, before he said, "What can be better for a man than his own parlor and chimney corner?" And now he says that the telegraph is great so long as the speculators in cotton and politics don't get possession of it. And this character doesn't have a name, so I suspect Hawthorne was using him kind of as a foil, somebody who would bring up the typical arguments of the time against what Hawthorne was saying. But that guy makes some good points. He understood the value of the home, which, if you take it for granted, seems like nothing special, but it's becoming increasingly difficult for young people to own a home, so it's not to be taken for granted. And he, or rather Hawthorne, because of course Hawthorne is writing this, foresaw the dangers of the control of business and political interests on the lines of communication, which is an extremely important thought. Those are the passages that I wanted to show you from The House of the Seven Gables. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you will go over to my website, volrathpublishing.com, and order yourself a copy of the edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I printed. I have it at a good price with free shipping. I worked with an artist to develop original cover art that I think reflects an important aspect of the story. It has excellent print quality. I'm very pleased with how it came out. And Frankenstein is one of those books that I think everybody should read. If you haven't read it, you should order yourself a copy right now and do so. If you have, it makes an excellent gift. You should order a copy for a friend or a family member. Frankenstein is as relevant today as it was when it was first published over 200 years ago. It is a prescient warning about the destructive power of technology and how easy it might be for us to build something with which we can destroy ourselves. It's quite fast-paced. There's a lot of action. There's a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. And I have included 97 footnotes throughout the book that explain some of the literary, historical, geographical references that Mary Shelley makes, and some of the more unusual vocabulary words that she uses. And those footnotes ease and accelerate the reading so that you don't have to stop and go look the word up. There's just a footnote right at the bottom of the page that you can glance at and then keep going. I read Frankenstein for the first time as an adult just a few years ago, and I was floored by it, which is part of why I prepared an edition of it so that I could present it to you for you to enjoy. So I hope you'll go over there right now and get yourself a copy. Volrathpublishing.com. The link is in the description. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.